All right, so we're going to dive into the code here, and I've decided to take these 4 transition properties and break them into 2 separate videos, just so that you don't get bored, hopefully. So the first 2 that we're going to take a look at are duration and property. So we'll start off with transition duration, which essentially says how long the transition should take, how long it should last. So the syntax is pretty straightforward: transition dash duration and then a time, 1 second or a decimal, half of a second. And you can also pass in multiple values separated by commas. We'll come back to that after we take a look at the next property, which is called transition property. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first, let's demo these first 2. So I have a code pen open. I'm calling it transition playground. All that we have so far are 2 boxes, one called boring and one called animated. But right now they both do the exact same thing. They're purple. They've got white text, center aligned. That's pretty much all that matters. There's a border radius. And then as we hover, the background changes and they double in size. So you can see I hover, turn red, and they double in size. Both of them do the exact same thing. Nothing different. What we're going to do is use transition duration to make this one take a little bit longer. We'll start off with 1 second. So it has a class of animated. So I'm just going to target that class, .animated. And then all we have to do is transition duration 1s if we want 1 second. So the first one is unchanged, but the second one now takes a second. And you'll notice that it's applying to both things that are changing, both properties. So the background takes a second to turn red. It's not immediate like it is here. And the scale takes a second as well. So we could also do something faster, of course. Let's do 0.3 seconds. So that one still is instant, but this one takes a little bit longer. And even though it's only 0.3 seconds, it still feels very, very different than this one here. So you can see, I'm not saying this is a good interface, but you can see the difference that these tiny changes can make just in the timing as to how something actually feels to a user. Okay, so moving on now to our second property, which is transition dash property. And this allows us to specify which of the properties that are being changed do we actually want to transition. So we may not want everything to take a second or 5 seconds or whatever it is. So in this case, we have 2 things that are being transitioned, the background and the transform. And that's because by default, everything is transitioned. So if I added something else in here, let's say I add opacity and I make opacity go to 0.5. So as I hover here, I guess it's kind of hard to tell because we're also doing color, but the opacity is being animated. It takes a second. It's not happening immediately. So if I actually slow that down, you'll be able to notice that. Let's do 2 seconds. So you can see that it's becoming clearer over those 2 seconds. So that brings us back to transition property. This allows us to specify exactly which properties should be transitioned, and anything that we leave out will not be transitioned. So in this case, I could say only background, or only opacity, or only transform. I could specify multiple, color and opacity, and I could keep going with commas. There's not a limit there. Or I could say all, which is what's happening currently, even though we're not explicitly stating that. So let's try it now. Let's go up here, and all we do is add transition dash property. And let's say we only want the color, the background, to animate. So I could say background or background color. Technically, it's better to be more specific. There we go. So only background color should animate. This one's still the same, of course, because we're not doing anything to it. But this one, you can see that the opacity and the scale are triggered immediately. And the color takes a bit, but because that opacity is there, the color is changing right away, but that's actually the opacity, so it's kind of confusing. It might be clearer if I comment that out. And now you can see that, okay, the scale is happening immediately, but the background color is taking a second. So the same thing applies to transform. So let's actually change this up a bit and add in a rotation as well. So I'll rotate it 45 degrees. And remember, we have to do these on the same line, because if I try and do transform rotate as a second line, it will actually overwrite the scale and it will only rotate. So if I want to have multiple transforms, I need them to be together. But the problem with that, and what I'll show you here, first, here's what happens currently. Only the background color is being animated. But if I go back here and I change this to be transform, just like that, you'll notice that both things are now being transitioned. So I can't actually be specific here and say I only want to transition the scale or the rotation. I can only say the generic transform, which is scale and rotate. So you cannot specify that, which is kind of unfortunate. So we have one property being transitioned, which is transform. It just happens that transform has two components. So I'm going to get rid of that, simplify it again, and now I'm going to return back to this thing that I mentioned, where we could have a comma separated set of durations along with a comma separated set of properties. So I'll add in one more property. This time let's also do border radius. And let's see, I have it at 20. Let's make it 50, which should give us a circle. There you go. Okay, so it's becoming a circle here. So what I want to show is that we can animate, let's do background color, comma, border radius. So we're saying take 2 seconds to transition background and border radius, but don't worry about our transform. So you'll notice the transform happens immediately. It scales, it doubles in size, but then the border radius, turning it into a circle, and the background color take 2 seconds. It's kind of cool looking, actually. So that brings us to what I just brought up, which is we can also pass in 2 different durations. So I could ask the background color to take 5 seconds and the border radius to take 1 second. So the order does matter. It's the order we established above. But now you'll see that the background takes a lot longer to animate. It's still going, but the border radius finished up pretty quickly. So the order that things happen in is that the scale is immediate because there's no transition assigned. It's left out, and any other things that we would assign here, if we change the font or the text color, font's not really animatable, but let's say we change the color of the text or the font size. Anything else that happens in here is not going to be transitioned. It's going to be immediate, just like the scale is. But the background will take 5 seconds, border radius 1 second, as you can see there. All right, so that covers those 2 properties, transition property and transition duration. We have 2 more to talk about in the next video, and then we'll also see a shorthand way to put them all together into a single line. So that's coming up.